In the annals of military history, there is one rule that remains absolute: take the high ground and hold it. To abandon a commanding position voluntarily is usually considered suicide, a tactical blunder that leads to encirclement and death. Yet, on a freezing morning in December 1805, the most brilliant military mind of the 19th century did exactly that. He not only gave up the key terrain, he practically invited his enemy to take it. This is the story of the Battle of Austerlitz. It is often called the Battle of the Three Emperors, a clash that would redefine the map of Europe for a decade. But beneath the gold braid and the oil paintings lies a far grittier reality. This was not a battle won by overwhelming firepower or brute strength. It was a victory secured through a massive, high-stakes psychological gamble. Napoleon Bonaparte, outnumbered and deep in hostile territory, realized that to destroy the combined armies of Russia and Austria, he had to do something counterintuitive. He had to look weak. So let's begin with the chessboard. The location is the rolling countryside of Moravia in what is now the Czech Republic. The date is December 2nd, 1805, the first anniversary of Napoleon's coronation. But the Emperor of the French was far from comfortable. He had marched his Grande Armée deep into Central Europe, stretching his supply lines to the breaking point. Facing him was the Third Coalition. Tsar Alexander I of Russia and Emperor Francis II of Austria had united their forces, creating a massive steamroller designed to crush the French Republic. The numbers were stark. Napoleon commanded roughly 73,000 men. The Allies fielded over 85,000, supported by 278 guns. But the real danger wasn't just the headcount, it was time. If Napoleon waited, Prussia would likely join the coalition, adding another 180,000 soldiers to the mix. He needed a decisive victory, and he needed it immediately. The center of the battlefield was dominated by the Pratzen Heights, a plateau that offered a perfect artillery platform and a command view of the entire area. Any competent general would have placed his heavy batteries there and dared the enemy to attack. Napoleon did the opposite. Days before the battle, he ordered his troops to abandon the Pratzen Heights and retreat to lower ground behind the Goldbach stream. To the Allied commanders, particularly the young and eager Tsar Alexander, this looked like cowardice. Napoleon was retreating. He was terrified. The French emperor even went so far as to send an envoy to the Allied camp to propose a ceasefire, acting nervous and unsure. It was a masterclass in deception. By giving up the Pratzen, Napoleon was dangling a piece of meat in front of a starving wolf. He wanted the Allies to occupy the heights. Why? Because of the geography. By taking the Pratzen, the Allies would see the French right flank, commanded by Marshal Claude Legrand, appearing dangerously weak and thinly spread near the villages of Telnitz and Sokolnitz. Napoleon's plan was cold and precise. He wanted the Allies to pour their massive numbers off the Pratzen Heights and crash into his right flank. He wanted them to commit their reserves to crushing what they thought was the weak point. Once the Allies had emptied the center to crush the right, Napoleon would spring the trap. Hidden in the fog-filled valley of the Goldbach, right in the center, was Marshal Soult's Fourth Corps, the Iron Marshal. They were the hammer waiting for the anvil, but the plan relied on one terrifying variable. Could the weak French right hold long enough? The night of December 1st was brutal. Temperatures dropped and a thick, freezing fog settled over the valley. The French soldiers, exhausted from weeks of marching, slept on the frozen mud, eating cold rations. Napoleon, however, was awake. He rode along the lines where his soldiers, recognizing him in the dark, lit torches of straw, creating a line of fire that illuminated the French positions. The Allies saw this and interpreted it as them burning their encampments in preparation for a retreat. They took the bait. At 4 a.m., the Allied columns began to move. Just as Napoleon had predicted, they streamed off the Pratzen Heights, heading south to smash the French right at Telnitz. The noise was immense, thousands of boots, hooves, and caisson wheels churning up the half-frozen ground. The battle for Telnitz and Sokolnitz was savage. The French Third-Line Infantry Regiment found themselves fighting waves of Russians in close-quarters combat inside the narrow village streets. It was bayonet against bayonet, amidst burning cottages and the screams of the dying. The French were being pushed back. The line was buckling. This was the crisis point. If the right flank collapsed, Napoleon's army would be rolled up and destroyed. But Napoleon had an ace up his sleeve. He had summoned Marshal Davout's Third Corps from Vienna. These men had marched 70 miles in 48 hours, a feat of endurance that seems impossible by modern standards. Davout's exhausted troops arrived just as the line was breaking, plugging the gaps and turning the slaughter at the stream into a stalemate. Meanwhile, in the center, the fog was beginning to lift. It was 9 a.m. The sun of Austerlitz broke through the mist. On the Pratzen Heights, the Russian commander, General Kutuzov, an old, one-eyed warhorse who had sensed the trap but was overruled by the Tsar, suddenly looked down into the valley. What he saw must have turned his blood to ice. Emerging from the dissipation fog were not retreating Frenchmen, but the dense, disciplined columns of Marshal Soult's Fourth Corps. General Vandamme and General Saint-Hilaire were leading their divisions straight up the slope. The Allies had emptied the center to attack the right, leaving the key to the battlefield defended by only a skeleton crew of exhausted reserves. It was the Lion's Leap. The French infantry stormed the heights. The fighting was desperate. The Russians realized too late that they had been outmaneuvered. They tried to turn their columns around, marching back up the hill they had just descended, but they were disjointed and tired. The French seized the Pratzen Heights, effectively cutting the Allied army in two. Desperate to retake the center, the Tsar threw in the Russian Imperial Guard. These were the giants of the Russian army, the elite of the elite. They crashed into the French lines, momentarily breaking a French battalion and capturing an eagle standard. Napoleon, watching from his command post, saw the danger. He ordered in his own heavy cavalry reserves, the Grenadiers à Cheval and the Mamelukes of the Imperial Guard. What followed was a swirling, chaotic melee of steel and horseflesh on the plateau. Sabers clashed against cuirasses. The earth shook under the weight of thousands of heavy cavalry horses. The French Guard broke the Russian Guard. The center belonged to Napoleon. Now the trap snapped shut. With the Pratzen Heights in French hands, Napoleon brought up his artillery. He didn't just fire on the enemy troops. He looked down to the south, where the massive Allied left wing was still engaged with Davout, unaware that their center had collapsed. They were trapped against the Sachin Ponds, a series of frozen lakes. Napoleon ordered his gunners to lower their elevation. He wasn't targeting the men, he was targeting the ice. The French cannonballs smashed into the frozen surface. The ice shattered. Thousands of Russian troops, along with their horses and heavy artillery, were plunged into the freezing water. The panic was total. Men clawed at the slippery edges of the broken ice, weighed down by muskets and wet wool uniforms, only to be dragged under or blasted by grapeshot. The water turned red. By late afternoon, the silence returned to the Moravian fields. The scale of the victory was staggering. The Allies had lost 27,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The French had lost around 9,000. It was a total annihilation of the coalition's fighting power. 2 days later, Emperor Francis II of Austria agreed to an armistice. The Russian army limped back east. The Holy Roman Empire, a political entity that had stood for 1,000 years, effectively died on the slopes of the Pratzen Heights, formally dissolved shortly after the Treaty of Pressburg. If you visit the battlefield today, the peace monument, the Mohila Miru, stands atop the Pratzen Heights. It is a somber place. Beneath the grassy slopes, archaeologists and farmers still occasionally turn up buttons, rusted bayonets and bones, the grim remnants of the day Napoleon gambled his empire on a patch of empty ground. Austerlitz wasn't just a battle, it was a psychological operation executed with lethal precision. It proved that in war, the most powerful weapon isn't the musket or the cannon. It is the mind of the commander who knows exactly what his enemy wants to believe and uses that belief to destroy him.